right, friends, I hope everyone's well and I hope you're ready. And specifically, I hope you're ready for the transits in the month of March. It is a significant month. There's a lot happening. And yet, all of these transits have a very specific narrative. They're very much concentrated. We're very much talking about the elements of water and fire in the month of March. And not to mention that we have a lunar eclipse and then we have our final solar eclipse in the sign of Aries and that Aries Libra axis. So it's an eventful month. It's a transitional month. It is a month of closures and it's triggering new beginnings that is yet to come. And in this particular month, there are 22 transits. That's a lot. And what I'm going to try to do, I'm going to give you a kind of a narrative arc for the month today. And then I'm going to come back. My aim is to make 22 videos. It's like the astrology bootcamp month. I've never done this. I'm kind of verbose by nature. So to just come and to do 15, 20 minutes about one transit that's occurring and it's current, and then to go and edit it. It's a little bit outside of my box. So you guys are going to see me at the best of me and the worst of me. And I want to try to be brief because like I said, brevity is not my strong suit. So that's what I'm going to do. But I don't want to come back every time and just tell you guys what the transit of the days are, what the conjunctions and the aspects and the ingress and all of that, and just give you an interpretation. I want to come back over and over and put this in a larger context of a narrative of the month of March. And I feel that it's actually very important for us to look at all transits that way. They're telling a bigger narrative and a story. So it's good to understand them that way. And one way to actually start to understand transits in that way and how they're corresponding into our own chart and our own placement is to start keeping a kind of a transit journal. It's actually very important. I used to write this a lot, but since I write so much throughout the day, I have come to make a picture journal, a photo journal. So I will screenshot things that are a little bit out of ordinary. I will take photos of things that are representation of that day. I don't even focus on what the transits are. And the importance of this for me is, like, for example, with the lunations, with the eclipses, when certain planets trigger a certain point of a chart because of a transit, and you go back to your photos or your writings, it becomes illuminated what the symbolic meaning of these planets are and how they're manifesting in your life, and specifically how they're connecting themselves into your charts as transits. So that's an important thing to do because it allows us to understand the overarching narrative. There's always a bigger picture being told. It doesn't help us to understand these transits in little fragments of you'll get good news and then you have resolving issues with your family and this is happening with our motivation, and we have to understand a bigger picture. So my entire aim, just to sum it up, is to keep on coming back and keep constructing this larger story, and then you guys can assess how this is applying to your life. But with that said, I want to start today with just giving an overview of March, and then I will come back to do the first transit. And I don't know, maybe I'll put the transit list on the side, but since it's so long, it's going to be rolling pages or rolling slides on the side so you guys can get a feel for what's coming up. And one more thing before moving on, please remember to like, subscribe, and comment. Specifically comment because at heart, I'm a student and a researcher. And what I have come to learn is that you can reach some sort of a threshold of understanding with the symbolism. But when you start to see how it's unfolding itself in people's lives as their actual reality and daily experiences, they start to take on a lot more, they become more enriched. We start to understand how they're actually getting operationalized in real lives, how they're experienced. So if you write me your comments, I would, as always, greatly appreciate it. With that said, let us begin. So just to be a little dramatic, to get your attention, I'm going to call the month of March a month of reckoning, surrender, and then a fiery rebirth. Kind of reminds me of the mythological story of a phoenix burning and then rising from the ashes. And we'll see this theme, this huge theme of water and fire, because we're talking a lot about the sign of Pisces and Aries interactions and movement in the month of March. And we also have that trine coming through Cancer, where Mars is sitting there. It's finished its retrograde phase. It's still in its debilitation, but it's moving forward. Thank goodness for that. So I would say the month of March is about revisiting the past, and it's about the ignition of a new era. In a lot of ways, the month of March is a kind of a turning point. It's almost as if the past cycles and patterns have to be left behind in the month of March. Our old identities and ways of being are just not going to be accommodated. This is what the narrative is saying. Something new has to be ignited into place. And it won't end in March, but March is initiating it. We have a lot of this water and element fire working together in the month of March. In some ways, when we look at the beginning of the month with that heavy loaded Pisces stellium, it's becoming a month of very deep introspection. It's almost as if, especially with that Sun and Saturn conjunction, we're coming to some sort of an existential dissolution. And eventually, because of all these planets moving into Aries, it's like a culmination in an eruption that has to give way to some sort of a renewal. It's almost as if there's an act of surrender of one's power, especially with that Sun and Saturn conjunction in the month of March. And then Sun coming into exaltation in the sign of Aries. It's about surrendering our power and then reclaiming it back anew in the sign of Aries. And there's something else to remember about the Sun being in the sign of Pisces. When we talk about the solar cycle, the zodiacal cycle, Pisces is the last sign of the year. So that renewal that needs to come comes from the Sun when it enters into the sign of Aries. So it's saying something about that every year. But this time, having the pressure point from Saturn. And I will make a Saturn-Sun conjunction in the future. This is a very important conjunction to understand in general. And I'll talk about it when the episode actually comes up. But this is a different kind of dissolution, resetting, and reigniting again. And then initially, we have Venus station to go direct, and Mercury is just ingressing forward from Pisces into Aries. But both of them are going to start the retrograde motion in the sign of Aries and start to go back towards Pisces. And by the end of the month, they do make it back into Pisces. So in this way, we can think of these two personal planets retracing their steps back at some point in terms of how we think, how we communicate, what we value, what we desire. It's almost as if they come to assert themselves in the sign of Aries, but they have to retract back. They have to become dissolved again in order to get that great sense of what it is that needs to be initiated and started again in the sign of Aries when they make it back. And the way I'm going to give this general narrative, I'm going to say it's a story with 4 acts. And in the first act, we have to start with Mercury and Venus, which occurs between March 1st to March 17th. So in a lot of ways, March, because of these two personal planets, as I was saying, it's pulling us backwards towards reevaluation, reconsideration. And it's about redrawing past understanding and understanding them in a new way. For example, Venus retrograding in the sign of Aries, I've talked about this in other videos, is very much trying to understand what it means to cooperate and still at the same time have its own needs and desires met. So there's a self-orientation to Venus in the sign of Aries. But when it came out of Pisces the first time, it really wanted to assert itself in terms of this is what I want, this is who I am, this is what I need, this is how I want to connect. But there's a missing link still because this Venus has to dip back into the sign of Pisces. And it's compelled to think about old relationship patterns in those relationships, how it has assert itself or inserted itself into relationships. It's forcing Venus to contemplate how we connect with others, how we connect with ourselves. How do we do this simultaneously without it feeling like a contradiction where we're compromising our personal integrity, for example, for other people? And it's also making us question our creative impulses. For me, I know this is a huge question. I'm trying to restructure. How do I do, for example, my morning writings? How do I then go to work? How do I then come back and do these videos, do the writing, the outlines for them, and then transpose them or take them into the website? Is just like a one-man circus show. And there's the impulse and the urge to do it, but there's a sense of finitude into one's own personal energy and resources. How much can you ignite before you burn out? So I'm very much already consumed with this thought of how do I do this? And then right after Mercury goes, Venus starts its retrograde period, then Mercury starts its own, which Mercury represents the intellect. You know, Venus has that sensual component to it. It's about the five senses. How do we sense things? How do I feel things? Mercury, on the other hand, being about the intellect, is very cerebral. So it's not consumed with feelings or how do I sense things. Is how do I interpret things? How do I perceive things? How do I differentiate things? How do I analyze it? So the mind's being consumed with thinking about how have I made my past decisions? What was my rationale for it? Why did I do that? It's retracing back over the conversations that it had, things that's been said. So it's trying to reevaluate the mental framework that we have constructed or have become accustomed to. This retrograde in the sign of Aries too, which very much pertains to our individual self, is trying to negotiate with this or try to understand it. And at the same time, when Venus and Mercury are pushed into this contemplative mode of trying to figure things out, Sun and Saturn in the sign of Pisces come into a conjunction. And right after Saturn, Sun's going to hit Rahu and then Neptune. And the way that I see this is like a moment of existential questioning about the nature of our lives and nature of ourselves. Why do I love the person that I love? Why do I do the things that I do? Why do I think the way that I do? So it's all becoming very internal oriented, and we're trying to process, reevaluate a lot of things. And I feel that with all of these dynamics happening, we are going to be forced to a moment or an instant where we have to surrender. It's overwhelming with all the things that are happening between these two signs. And at the same time, nothing's really happening yet. It's just getting more intensified and intensified. There's no forward movement. I mean, the sun, the self, our power, our sense of being is coming into a conjunction with the universal gagging mechanism holding you, limiting you, which is Saturn. So there's a sense of constriction and you just can't move. You can't do anything about anything just yet. But there's all the sensation of it. There's all the thoughts about it. So we're going through this kind of a mode from, let's say, March 1st to March 17th. We're really trying to differentiate between what is real for us and what's been projected, what has been internalized that is not really ours. But somehow, somewhere along the line, we came to own it as our own, as ourselves. We're trying to figure out what of the past still holds power on us. Because we're supposed to move forward. Eventually, when all of these planets make it into Aries, and the eclipse happens there, which is denoting a kind of a closure and an opening and an invitation for the next 8.5 years. It's also a new portal, a new opening to a new way of being. But we can't get there if we're still carrying the baggage of the past and all the ways that wasn't authentically us. There's something about Aries at its best. It's authentically itself. It's raw. And it's like, this is me. This is how I am. But right now in the sign of Pisces, when Sun is conjunct Saturn, we're kind of understanding that extra weight in that backpack that we're carrying is not even ours. Venus and Mercury in their retrograde are contemplating this also. And just remember, this is just putting a general story into context. But as we get into the details of every transit of the month, this will become more clear too. And now I would move on to the Act 2 of the month, which is from March 12th to about March 24th. And I would call this the Great Dissolution. That's what this part of the month is about. I know this is overlapping with the previous because I said from March 1st to March 17th, because I was putting that retrograde motion of Venus and Mercury into context with what's happening in Pisces. But when we move to the 12th of March specifically, that's when Sun makes its conjunction with Saturn. This is where Saturn's forcing the Sun asking it, Dear Father, because in the Vedic tradition, Saturn is Sun's son. So Saturn's kind of sunning his own father here. And it's asking the self, the father, what's real? What's an illusion here? What about you that's an illusion and it's not real? Because Saturn is a planet of realism, is the harsh truth of reality. Saturn's asking Sun, what about your own internal constitution, yourself, the structures that have been built that actually need to collapse? Because that's what the sign of Pisces does. Pisces doesn't support structures. It's about immersion. It's about incorporation, inclusion. It's like throwing a sugar cube in the water and it just melts and the water just becomes sweet. So in a lot of ways, Saturn's imposition here on the sun is that it's trying to strip away the self's fantasies and illusions about itself. And in the sign of Pisces, there can be many illusions about the self because that sense of differentiation of the self from the other is not strong in the sign of Pisces. We kind of just dissolve into the environment. The identity can become almost chameleon-like. And you lose that boundary of where the self begins and ends in the sign of Pisces. But Saturn wants that sense of realism from the sun and about itself. It wants to know the truth of its existence. That's what Saturn's asking us. It wants us to actually go even deeper because the sign of Pisces has to do with depth. It wants us to go deeper past that ego structure and that identity structure for the sun, for ourselves to understand the mandate of our soul. And this is a lot of pressure for a human being. Like a lot of us are just trying to get through the day. Like, what does a day demand of me? The moments that we have where we have these existential moments and questionings, they're very difficult to understand what the soul wants, what the depth and the core of your being wants. And Saturn's forcing that. That's the kind of realism that Saturn's actually bringing here, which is actually a little abstract, but the sign of Pisces abstract. And then this is happening on March 12th. Like this wasn't already being in a chokehold. On March 13th, we have the lunar eclipse in the sign of Virgo, which is opposing the sign of Pisces. And at the same time, if this wasn't a lunar eclipse, because the nodes would not be around, this is a full moon. So this is talking about a kind of a culmination in some ways. And it's kind of ironic that this is happening right after that realism that Saturn's trying to bring to the sun, because the sign of Pisces, I was saying, it can hold a lot of illusion. The sign of Virgo, that earth sign, that problem-solving sign, the sign where Mercury, the intellect, is exalted in it, is taking us to how we are actually delusional in the real world, what it is that we do. That's what that eclipse is bringing forth. It's like bringing us into direct confrontation with earthly consequences because the lunar eclipse is happening in the sign of Virgo and its moon being conjunct Ketu. So in a sense, sun's problems now need real earthly, material, tangible applications. It's not like we have an existential moment of, oh my God, this is not how I'm not right in myself and in the world. But that lunar eclipse is saying, I'm not letting go. And we got to remember these eclipses in the Virgo Pisces axis has just started. That axis has just been triggered recently. This is because the next solar eclipse, which is a few days later, is the closure of the Aries and Libra eclipses. So now for the next couple of years, we have to begin to grapple with the discrepancy between the spirit and the material. That self, the essence, that is eternal, indivisible, and yet how it's coming to clash with material reality. And usually that happens when we don't have a good sense of ourselves, when we've been strayed off our path, when we have these illusions and delusions about who we are and who we are becoming. This is when the soul no longer has a real life application in its manifest form. So in the next 2 years, we have to understand this discrepancy, and we are going to work on it to resolve it. But this lunar eclipse is bringing that forth, especially because that conjunction just completed with Sun and Saturn in the sign of Pisces, opposing where the lunar eclipse is happening. So after this, which was on March 13th, we have a few days to simmer in our confusion until March 17th, where the sun comes to meet Rahu in the sign of Pisces. And this is kind of like the Venus video that I was talking about, when Venus in the sign of Pisces in its direct motion first hits Saturn and then it hits Rahu, North Node. It's almost like being told what the truth of something is, what the gravity of something is. And then as soon as they come into conjunction with Rahu, the sun too here, it's almost as if it's again forgotten. Because the patterns that are entrenched in us run deep. The sign of Pisces is deep. It's showing us how deep they are wired into us, how easy it is for us to revert back. And in some ways, thank God that Mercury and Venus are going through this retrograde motion and crossing over all these planets in Pisces again. Because we need a reminder to deeply understand how it is that we need to reconfigure ourselves. And in some ways too, when the sun meets Rahu, and Rahu's known as the engulfer of the sun, his entire objective is to eat the sun. It's to distort that sense of self. It can amplify it. That's one of the ways that Rahu amplifies and distorts the symbolism of the sun. And since Saturn was just asking it some existential questions about the nature of its own reality, this search for meaning becomes over exaggerated in some ways too, and it can become very overwhelming. So we're really set into motion of now questioning, am I serving my purpose? What is my purpose? My purpose has to be bigger than this. Like this life that I'm living, what am I doing? Or on the other hand, because Rahu amplifies, we can get lost in the sauce of our own persona, our own ego identity that's very unhealthy. And we can suddenly fall into this mirage of self-importance and its grandiose illusions too. So this conjunction with Rahu, it's a matter of amplification of the self. And the self just became very important to the self because it met Saturn. And Saturn made it very self-conscious, self-aware. Saturn makes us lose our confidence. When we don't have confidence, we actually become very self-oriented. When we are confident beings, we don't think about ourselves anymore. We're just doing the tasks. We're engaged with the world. What can I do for you? You yourself become a non-issue. You don't sit there and contemplate yourself so much. But Saturn just drains that vitality out of the sun. It takes his confidence away. So suddenly it's making it very hyper aware of itself. And then it comes to contact with a planet like North Node Rahu, which amplifies it again. So we've got to ask, what's being amplified? That thing of, I'm small, I don't know my purpose? Or is it just puffing yourself back up again and being all pompous and be like, I know what I'm supposed to do in the world, I'm going for it. There's an imbalance here whenever planets meet Rahu. I would say with the exception of Mercury. I like Mercury and Rahu conjunctions, but not when Mercury is debilitated. We'll talk about that when we get to it. And then again, this was on March 17th. Like, things aren't already confusing enough. Sun has to come into conjunction with Neptune on the 19th, 2 days later. And this conjunction, again, is not a normal conjunction because it's happening at the 29-degree mark of a water sign, which is Pisces. This is a critical point. This is called Gandanta point in Vedic astrology. The anaretic degrees in Western astrology, there's an entanglement. There's almost a karmic destiny that needs to be untangled at these last points where we transition from water to fire signs. And I would say that Neptune's job here is to initiate that dissolution of the old ego, because Neptune will demand the sun to surrender. You don't know better. You don't know yet. But what was is not what you're going to take into the sign of Aries. All the rigid self-definitions that we had are going to become very nonsensical. So it's kind of dissolving the identity into the unknown. And this is important for the rebirth of the sun and the sign of Aries to commence a new cycle where it's going to become exalted, active, and very powerful. It's something about existence is demanding of us not to take the whole and the totality of the old identity into the new cycle. So there's deep questioning of it. There's a deep need to surrender it. And these things are always painful. They're never easy. So it's important to remember this. You know, people want to talk about these kinds of things in terms of spirituality and give it a high culture feel. But to go through these processes in life, it's extraordinarily painful. So we have to be patient with this, be like water, as Bruce Lee said, don't resist, and we'll be taken there anyway, willing or unwillingly. And I would say it's painful because by the time Sun hits Neptune, the lines of reality have been really blurred. Our self-concept comes to unravel. Our old beliefs feel super unstable. We kind of feel naked and exposed, before Sun makes its ingress into the sign of Aries, we're still talking about winter. If you look at the trees, they're all bare and naked. That's what the sun's supposed to do in the sign of Pisces. It's like, this is as naked and as truthful as I can get before it initiates a new life. But this time, we got some heavy duty planets in the sign of Pisces, so it's not like any other year. See, I'm very verbose. I should be done with this video yet, but I'm still at Act 2. Let's move on to Act 3. So I would say I would give Act 3 from March 20th to 29th, and I would call this the return of fire. Thank God from all that Pisces. I know some people are very much water-loving people. I think I'm a fire-loving person. Don't throw me in a bathtub or a swimming pool. I do like showers every day, but put me in front of a fireplace, I'll just sit there till my face is puffed up from the heat 6 hours later. I don't know. So I'm happy about the return of fire. And not to mention, this is not just Sun going into a fire sign. This is Sun's exaltation. And that's why I'm calling it the return of fire. And this is where we're going to have, during this time period, we're also going to have the final solar eclipse on this axis, which I'm also grateful for that because I have my moon in Aries. And I have good old Saturn in the other cardinal sign of Cancer. So this has not been a fun eclipse, but let us discuss it because this is not about me. Okay. So on March 20th, Sun makes its ingress into the sign of Aries. This is initiating a new solar cycle. And of course, in the sign of Aries, the Sun is reclaiming its power. But again, this is not any old renewal of the Sun in the sign of Aries because there's a solar eclipse here, which is on March 29th. And this eclipse is going to close a chapter of the last 2 years, as I just said, which was all about confronting some sort of a balance between the self and cooperation and connection with other people. During this eclipse, like the past 2 years and all the other eclipses that have already occurred in this axis, one more time, we have to ask these questions. And if we pay attention, these questions were being posed to us by this axis. Do we stand alone or do we merge with others? This is going to be a question again coming up with this eclipse. Can I maintain my independence and still be in a partnership? How do I compromise with others without compromising myself? Because it's a very fine and an intricate dance to be the self and yet to be for other people. And this axis has just put us through the grinder of this dynamic and understanding this. So in a lot of ways, this last eclipse, especially considering what just happened to Sun with Saturn and all the other conjunctions, this is a decisive moment of which part of my identity, which part of myself, which part of my individuality has to stay intact, because this is the essence of my soul and the core of my being, and which parts of it does it have to go and to be relinquished, because this is probably what was hindering us from having healthy relational dynamics with other people, whether it was an intimate relationship, a love relationship, or any other kind of a relationship. And look at the house where this axis is. It's talking about the people pertaining to that house, the themes related to that house and how we've been trying to connect with it. So in some ways, this eclipse is about how do we reclaim ourselves, while at the same time understanding a huge part of life is about the self being for others. So it's bringing these themes in to our field of vision for the last time and very intensely. And we got to remember, this eclipse is not going to give us a final answer right there and then, because if you recall, the eclipse is happening at 9 degrees of Aries. Where do Venus and Mercury station retrogrades? At 10 and 9 degrees of Aries. So we're going to have to grapple with these still for weeks and months to come, with these questions that are being posed until these two planets pass their shadow degrees, which is past this point of the eclipse, which is happening at 9 degrees of Aries. So we still have to grapple with unresolved themes of love, connection, communication, all the things that happened earlier in March when Venus and Mercury were there. These things, this is what we were thinking about. That was a contemplative process earlier in the month. And while this is happening, this solar eclipse, this is when Mercury has just dipped back into Pisces, which is its debilitation, and is conjuncting Neptune. So it's kind of like the body and the soul wants to move forward in the sign of Aries. The future is calling the soul, but somehow the mind has been left behind. The intellect has been left behind. The mind needs to get caught up while we're compelled to move forward. The sun feels compelled to move forward in the sign of Aries. And Venus is still looking back in its retrograde motion, trying to understand the connections in the past relative to what needs to happen in the future. So that's what I'm saying. This is an ongoing thing. This is not like, okay, the eclipse happens, we have a eureka moment, it's entrenched, it's embodied, it becomes our wisdom. It's still a work in progress, but it's super intensified in this way. So in a way, the future is calling us, but there's one last reckoning with our past that still needs to unfold. We still need to understand a couple of things. And if you think about it in some ways, I also talked about this in the Venus in Aries videos. Water and fire, both of them are purifying elements. Water erodes and dissolves back into the existential ocean, while fire burns the external shell of things, the appearance, so that we're left with the essence. So in a lot of ways, we're being purified of our past ways, going back to what I was initially saying, those deep entrenched wiring and ways of being actually don't have tangible application in the real world and the reality of our lives. That lunar eclipse in Virgo. So we need to realign ourselves. This is kind of a purification from the past that no longer has an application in the present, so that the theory of the future can find its own application, so that theory can go into practice, which we call living and living our lives. Now this moves us to the fourth and the final act, which is very inconclusive, but huge, something to consider, especially in the context of the narrative of March and how it's setting the stage for the future. So we can call this fourth act the threshold of dreams. And I say this because Neptune, after 14 years, is going to make its first ingress into the sign of Aries. So in a sense, again, from that water to that fire, we have purification of past dreams. There has to be a transformation where dreams can now find an application for action, with an action. The things that were passive and dreamt about, they unfolded within the mind's eye as visions, must now become something that can act and be active in the world, because that's what the sign of Aries is about. Ignite, act, individuate, become a form that's discernible and distinguished and separate from other things. So if you think about the past 14 years, whether if it was yoga, astrology, any kind of Eastern philosophy, I don't know, all the stuff that people talked about, and it all got categorized under the word spirituality, were very abstract, and they didn't really have real life application, a lot of them. I mean, how did they even come to us as these sound bites in a dreamy way through the medium of the internet, for example? Now they demand some action with application. So a lot of things in the next 14 years will be debunked, will be set aside. because you can't take it from that abstract world into the world of form where the form has to perform the action. So Neptune coming into Aries is denoting a new era. And I'm actually excited to talk about one of the final episodes of this series to talk about Neptune here moving into Aries, because it's going to pretty much define the next decade and a half, which are also connecting themselves to Pluto and Uranus, which is huge, but we'll leave that for later. Oh my God, I thought, is this an earthquake? There's an earthquake, guys. Holy fuck. I gotta get my cat. All right, guys. That was an earthquake. Not sure. I've been in a couple of earthquakes. Sometimes a small one comes first and then the bang comes later. So I just got my cat, got the shelter ready and thought in case it hits. So let us continue. But I have like heart palpitations right now. That's crazy. All these control and things that we talk about in life, and then when Mother Nature acts, we are these little ants. But let us continue with Neptune. Excuse me if I don't know where I left off, but I'm just going to start here with Neptune in terms of what it's doing in the arc of this narrative that's being set up in March. So in some ways, the self is going through this transition and into a new era that, the eclipses just ended here. It's just culmination of understanding and certain things that need to change. And a lot of this transition of Neptune has to do with how do we actually engage? But I will come back to this Neptune transition, and it's a short while. It's going to go back into the sign of Pisces again before it makes its final ingress into the sign of Aries. So in conclusion, we could say the month of March is not just a bunch of transits that are denoting minor adjustments. That's not its story. It's very much a month of confrontation with the self specifically, and how the self is connecting itself to the world and how it can find an application for it. It has a lot to do with dissolution of the old and the ignition and the igniting of the new. It's setting the pace, it's setting the stage for that. It's a time where old paradigms and patterns have to collapse. They have to unravel so that the new identities and new ways of being can be formulated in their place. We're all a finite space, and it's constantly, everything's being reconfigured in that space. We like to think we can expand the horizon infinitely, but we can. A lot of times we have to die. The old has to be washed away, dissolved like the water, or burnt into ashes before something new can emerge, like the phoenix from the ashes. But then again, we can see in the month of March is not just cutting the ties or the rope from the past. It's asking us to constantly revisit it, and in this revisitation of it, that we're constantly redrawing what is yet to be. And as we can see with all the movement of the sun from the beginning to the end of it, something about the self has to also surrender here. This is not something we can force into place. We can't juxtapose or pile things on top of the old ones. We have to get rid of the old layer, create a new opening so that something new can come forth. In a way, the soul has to surrender the things that are not itself so that it can have its full sovereignty. And that final Aries solar eclipse is about this self-realization. And Neptune's ingress shortly after into the sign of Aries is kind of giving us a glimpse of this new era, how we can dream again, but how we must this time around in the sign of Aries have application to act them out. In a way, we could say the story of March is a story of a renewal, is about crossing points, thresholds. It's a story of loss, but it's setting the stage for renewals. And there are endings that are giving birth. There are endings that are giving birth to a new beginning. And I think the final question we'll be left with when it's all said and done this month, what the story is going to evoke as a question within, is that now that the fire is returning, now that the fire has returned, now that the soul is regaining its power without the persona, without the illusions, and without the delusions, what do we do with it? What do we do with the fire that demands of us to act? How are we going to act? And I'll leave you guys with that. I will be back to do the first transit of the month, which happens on March 1st. And this one is about Mercury and Pisces conjunct Rahu at 27 degrees. This is before Mercury makes its first ingress into Aries, where it's going to have to station to start its retrograde motion. So we're still in Pisces with Mercury on March 1st. And another thing I'm going to do before closing off here. So I'm taking the outlines that I'm making for the videos and taking them to the website. I will be posting it there. And as the days goes by and as I do more of the transit, I'm just going to add to that transcript instead of having multiple posts. So it's just going to be the narrative of March transits. And you guys can look at that if you're a reader and you prefer reading or to also read. And yes, I'll be back with the March 1st transit. Sending you much love. Till next time.